All right, so reflection paper 4 is due tonight. For next time, we're going to be reading the Jeremy Bentham essay, The Principle of Utility. You're going to find a lot to connect that to the Adam Smith that we're talking about today. And then that itself is going to tie into the Martin Buber essay and the Ursula Le Guin essay that we'll be reading the following week. And do remember to submit your 3 words to the vocab folder. So before we get started talking about Adam Smith, does anybody have any questions about anything? Anything particularly bothering you right now?
So next Tuesday we'll have another reflection paper.
Next Tuesday you'll have another reflection paper, yep. Okay, so I'd like to start with this list of situations that I've put up here on the board. Whether or not you have directly experienced any of these things, I want you to just take a few minutes and think about how each of these things would make you feel if they happened to you. So let's, just start with the first one here. It's like, what, if your best friend moves to another state, how does that make you feel?
Sad.
Yeah. They're your friend. You miss them, right? What if you get a new puppy? Yeah. Right? It's adorable and it's fuzzy and it kisses your face and it wants to play, right? Yeah. Getting a new puppy ought to make you happy. Now, number 3 here, right? The school bully pulls your pants down in front of your crush.
Sad.
Can we think of something more specific maybe than sad?
Embarrassed.
Yeah, embarrassed, humiliated, right? Yeah. Now, what if you're awarded a full, no-strings-attached scholarship to your dream college?
Ecstatic.
Yeah, this is a pretty big deal, right? It's like, hey, I can go to the college I want to and I don't have to pay a cent, right? So ecstatic and maybe also a little bit relieved, right? Because then you're not burdened with the kinds of financial worries that you might otherwise be if you have to take out a shit ton of loans, right? Now here's a fun one. You win a major humanitarian award.
Proud.
Okay, yeah, proud. Maybe a little confused. But yeah, proud. All right, I did a thing, and I'm being recognized for it. A family member develops a debilitating illness, and you have to quit school or your job to take care of them. This one might create more complicated feelings, right?
I'm just sad.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's certainly a sadness in there, right?
You could be having this.
Yeah, it could be angry, right? About what you're having to give up and about, what the universe is doing to your loved one, right? So would resentful maybe be a good way to put that? What else might you feel in a situation like this? Depressed? Yeah, because you're going from the life you've built to yourself, right, back to the family home where you're just going to be kind of stuck taking care of another person, right? However much you love that person, it's perfectly reasonable to feel depressed in these kinds of circumstances. So yeah, you might feel resentful, you might feel depressed, right? You might feel anxious, right? What am I going to do for money now? So yeah, there's a whole, and you might feel pity or compassion for your relative, right? So we can imagine how we would feel if we were placed in these particular situations, right? Even if these are not situations that are personally familiar to us, right? I know that I have personally experienced only half of these, right? 1, 2, and 6 I have had happen. But what happens when you imagine someone else in these situations? Someone who's not you. Can you imagine someone else in these situations? Yeah, if you can imagine yourself, right? If you can imagine these things happening to you, you can imagine them happening to someone you know or even to a stranger. And do you feel quite the same thing when these things happen to a stranger than when they happen to you? Certainly, probably with less intensity, right? When something good happens to someone else, we're generally happy for them, right? Unless it's someone we really, really hate. And when something bad happens to them, then we sympathize with their plight. And this is the basic argument that Adam Smith is making in the theory of moral sentiments, right? That most of our moral behavior comes from our ability to imagine ourselves in other people's situations, right? To place ourselves imaginatively in someone else's shoes. And this doesn't just work with real people, right? Say you're watching a movie, right? And for argument's sake, I'm not a sports fan, but let's say you're watching a football movie, right? How do you feel when the hero of the movie, the protagonist you're supposed to be rooting for, scores a touchdown? Yeah, you feel good, right? Even though there's no particular reason you ought to, right? This isn't someone you know. It's not even a real person playing in a real game. But we still get caught up, if we're reading a book or watching a movie, in the lives of these imaginary characters, right? And the sorts of things that they're going through, whatever their struggles and triumphs are, we feel something for them. Right? Otherwise, if we got no particular emotional thrill from watching movies or reading books, we probably wouldn't do those things, right? So, are you all familiar with the name Adam Smith? Do you know what Adam Smith is best known for?
Yeah.
Okay. What is Smith best known for then, James?
The Wealth of Nations.
Yes. A book called The Wealth of Nations. First published in 1776. And what do you know about what is the content of The Wealth of Nations? What's the basic argument of The Wealth of Nations?
Like the invisible hand.
Okay, yeah, the idea of the invisible hand. And how does the invisible hand work? What is it? What does it do?
What do it? Like runs the economy.
Uh-huh.
And the economy. A part of the economy.
Yeah. So essentially what Smith is doing in The Wealth of Nations is making an argument for free market economies, right? At a time when this is actually still a pretty novel argument. This is a pretty novel idea. And what he's arguing, basically, is that free market economies tend to regulate themselves better than tightly, centrally controlled economies that are kind of like built from a top-down structure, right? And some of the ideas that he's drawing on are from this book of moral philosophy that he'd written about 20 years earlier, right? One of the reasons he thinks this idea works is because he thinks people are predisposed to sympathize with each other, to imagine themselves in other people's shoes, and thus to deal fairly and honestly with each other. Now let's try to compare these ideas to some of the other thinkers we've read that have something to say about human nature. Let's maybe start with Thomas Hobbes. What was Hobbes' argument about human nature? What does Hobbes think happens when you leave humans to their own devices?
See the one that said brutish and
Yeah. Human life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, right? Right, so Hobbes believed that our natural state was not cooperation, but competition. That what we really wanted was what our neighbor had. And if there's nothing to stop us from taking it, we're just going to take it. So, Hobbes would clearly disagree with the basis of Smith's theory here, right? That people are predisposed to cooperate with each other because we feel sympathy for other human beings. Now, what about Thomas Malthus? This might be a little more complicated.
what do you mean?
What did Malthus seem to believe about people? We know what he believed about resources, right? What did he seem to believe about people and how people behave when no one's watching or no one's holding them to account?
Poorly. Bad.
What's that?
Poorly.
Yeah, okay. Often poorly. And that indeed, the segments of society that are least inclined to behave in a moral fashion, as Malthus argued, right, are also those that are most likely to find themselves short of resources. So letting that part of the population die off then basically solves both your moral problems and your food problem. Now, we can also kind of look at these ideas in terms of more modern thinkers. Right? Remember Martha Nussbaum's arguments, for example, that what we really want education to do is produce people who are capable of feeling sympathy with others in order to advance genuine democratic principles, right? That if you can't imagine yourself in another person's shoes, they're just an abstraction to you to argue against. And as such, there's no particular reason for you to respect their arguments or their humanity. But there's a difference there too, right? Where does Nussbaum think our ability to sympathize comes from?
Education.
Yeah, it's something we have to learn, right? So she would probably still argue that our nature might be something a little bit more like what Hobbes says it is, right? But we learn sympathy really, through education and acculturation. If we were naturally sympathetic, we wouldn't need to learn it. So let's go to the Smith essay and see kind of what directly he has to say about this on page 457. Can I get one of y'all to just read the first paragraph of this, starting with how selfish soever man may be supposed.
How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others, and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. Of this kind is pity or compassion, the emotion which we feel for the misery of others, when we either see it or are made to conceive it in a very lively manner. That we often derive sorrow from the sorrow of others is a matter of fact too obvious to require any instances to prove it. For this sentiment, like all the other original passions of human nature, is by no means confined to the virtuous and humane, though they perhaps may feel it with the most exquisite sensibility. The greatest ruffian, the most hardened violator of the laws of society, is not altogether without it.
Okay, thank you. So, let's first try to unpack this first sentence here, right? Which is, it's, as is typical of 18th century prose, right? It's a kind of bunch of clauses piled on top of each other, right? How selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others. So, what's interesting about the way Smith starts this sentence? What is he assuming about people here?
That they think man is selfish.
Yeah. That even if we assume that human beings are selfish, right? There are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortunes of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it. So, why, if we're selfish, do we still like seeing other people happy?
We do derive pleasure from seeing
Yeah. We get some kind of aesthetic or emotional enjoyment from it, right? So our sympathy actually comes from a selfish root, right? We like to see other people happy because it makes us feel good when we see other people happy. And it makes us feel bad when we see other people in pain or suffering, right? So in order to mitigate our own pain and suffering, we like to see others happy. Right? Of this kind is pity or compassion, the emotion which we feel for the misery of others when we either see it or are made to conceive it in a very lively manner. Now we can trace this back to the discussion we had before class, right? We talked about books and movies, for example, right? That we don't actually need to directly, see someone suffering. It doesn't have to be someone closer to someone we know, right? We can sympathize with fictional sufferings as well, so long as it's brought vividly to our imaginations. That we often derive sorrow from the sorrow of others is a matter of fact too obvious to require instances to prove it. For this sentiment, like all of the other original passions of human nature, is by no means confined to the virtuous and humane, though they may perhaps feel it with the most exquisite sensibility. So sensibility is one of these key 18th century words. It's used primarily in art theory, and also in early, 18th century psychology, which is really kind of proto-psychology. They didn't know that much about how the mind works. But what sensibility means, essentially, is sensitivity or receptiveness to sense impressions. Right, so someone with a high degree of sensibility is someone who is going to derive more pleasure or pain than the ordinary person from observation, from impressions of other people's feelings, right? So sensibility is, in the 18th century, often a kind of key word for a certain level of cultivation, right? The person of sensibility feels for, cares for the sufferings of others. And then I think probably the most interesting sentence here is the last one in this paragraph. Can I get somebody to read this again for us, starting with the greatest ruffian?
The greatest ruffian, the most hardened violator of the laws of society, is not altogether without it.
Okay, so what's this sentence mean? What's going on here?
Even the worst criminal is not without.
Yeah, the worst criminal, right? The person who doesn't give a shit about the law still has some kernel of sympathy for others within them, right? So what does that mean about, say, where sympathy comes from?
It's inherent.
Yeah, it's an inherent quality, right? Not something that you get either through education, right? Not something that that can be sort of inculcated in you through law, right? Yeah, so sympathy is, right, one, inherent, and also universal among human beings. Everybody has it. Everybody feels it. Maybe to varying degrees, but everybody has it. Okay, can I get somebody to continue with this for us with the second paragraph here, as we have no immediate experience of what other men feel?
As we have no immediate experience of what other men feel, we can form no idea of the manner in which they are affected, but by conceiving what we ourselves should feel in the like situation. Though our brother is upon the rack, as long as we ourselves are at our ease, our senses will never inform us of what he suffers. They never did and never can carry us beyond our own person, and it is by the imagination only that we can inform any conception of what are his sensations. Neither can that faculty help us to this any other way than by representing to us what would be our own. If we were in his case, it is the impressions of our own senses only, not those of his, which our imaginations copy. By the imagination we place ourselves in his situation, we conceive ourselves enduring all the same torments. We enter, as it were, into his body, and become in some measure the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensations, and even feel something which, although weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them. His agonies, when they are thus brought home to ourselves, when we have thus adopted and made our own, begin at last to affect us. And we then tremble and shudder at the thought of what he feels. For as to be in pain or distress of any kind excites the most excessive sorrow, so to conceive or to imagine that we are in it excites some degree of the same emotion, in proportion to the vivacity or dullness of the conception.
Okay, thank you. So, if we're observing another person's suffering, what can we not actually do?
Feel exactly what they're feeling.
Yeah, we can't feel exactly what that person's feeling, right? From my position up here at the front of the classroom, right, I can make some judgments from observing your faces about how bored or how engaged you are, right? But I can't actually sit and inhabit your person and feel whether or not you're following along with me, right? But I can think back to when I was a student and when I was feeling either engaged or disengaged, right? And then try to imagine what this experience feels like for you. And, if I care enough, adjust my pedagogy accordingly. But yeah, the big key point here is that we can't actually share another person's senses, right? Right. Our sensory world is completely self-contained. I think I might have mentioned in a previous class a philosopher who was a contemporary of Smith's, a guy by the name of George Berkeley. And Berkeley was operating from a fairly similar set of assumptions, which is why I bring him up here. But Berkeley is the guy who argued that there is no such thing necessarily as material substance, right? There isn't necessarily any such thing as matter, that the only things we know are what we are sensing right now. And that when the two of you are not in this room, I have no evidence that you actually exist. When I'm not in this room, I have no evidence the room itself actually exists. I have no evidence that anything that I'm not directly sensing exists. And because the only thing that's real to me is my own sensory apparatus, I can never really know if we have any kind of shared reality. Right? For all I know, y'all could be figments of my imagination. Maybe you are. I don't know. But Smith is not quite going that far, right? But he is noting that, like, our capacity for sympathy exists only kind of in ourselves, right? And in our ability to project ourselves into imaginary situations. Even situations in which the person we pity, the person we feel sorry for, doesn't feel the same emotions that we do, right? So let's go to the example on page 459. Can I get one of you to read the paragraph that starts with all the calamities to which the condition of mortality exposes mankind?
Of all the calamities to which the condition of mortality exposes mankind, the loss of reason appears to those who have the least spark of humanity by far the most dreadful. And they behold that last stage of human wretchedness with deeper commiseration than any other. But the poor wretch who is in it laughs and sings, perhaps, and is altogether insensible of his own misery. The anguish which humanity feels, therefore, at the sight of such an object, cannot be the reflection of any sentiment of the sufferer. The compassion of the spectator must arise altogether from the consideration of what he himself would feel if he was reduced to the same unhappy situation, and perhaps as impossible, was at the same time able to regard it with his present reason and judgment.
Okay, so what's the situation Smith is describing here?
Dementia?
Yeah, the kind of pity that we feel, or the sorrow that we feel at observing someone who is mentally ill, right? So yeah, he says someone who has lost their reason, right? Now, the whole idea of the loss of reason, right, to an 18th century philosopher is particularly terrifying, right? We're talking about an age that is, in intellectual history, that is sometimes called the age of reason. In which most thinkers are basically in agreement that the thing that separates human beings from beasts is the ability to reason, right? That because we have a greater capacity for thought and for acting on those thoughts than most animals do, that we are not simply animals, that we're something higher. And so in this case, he's describing someone who's lost the use of reason. and the feelings that excites in us. So why do we get upset, according to Smith, when we see someone who is suffering from mental illness?
Because we have reason. Like, we can
Uh-huh.
use that.
Yeah. But if we didn't, would we particularly feel the loss of it? If we happen to lose our wits ourselves, would we actually feel the loss of it, according to his example? No, he's just like a lot of madmen are perfectly happy, right? They laugh and they sing and they dance. They don't seem to be aware of or upset by their state, right? But we're upset by it. We're upset by seeing them this way. Because we look at them and we can imagine the same thing happening to us. Now, if we were actually in the situation, we'd be like them and wouldn't actually feel the loss, right? But because we're merely imagining, with our present powers of observation and sensibility, right? With our present powers of reason, we think about what a loss it would be for us if this were to happen, right? We'll compare this to what he says on page 460 here, right? The last long paragraph here. We sympathize even with the dead, and overlooking what is of real importance in their situation, that awful futurity which awaits them, we are chiefly affected by those circumstances which strike our senses, but can have no influence upon their happiness. It is miserable, we think, to be deprived of the light of the sun, to be shut out from life and conversation, to be laid in the cold grave, a prey to corruption and the reptiles of the earth, to be no more thought of in this world, but to be obliterated in a little time from the affections and almost the memory of their dearest friends and relations. Surely, we imagine, we can never feel too much for those who have suffered so dreadful a calamity. As someone who experiences relatively frequent existential crises, I can certainly identify with the kind of terror expressed here, right? But when we feel bad for a dead person, right, when we feel sympathy for a dead person, are we actually feeling for the dead person's real situation? Because where does all of our information about the world ultimately come from? Ourselves and our senses, right? Does a dead person still have the use of their senses? As far as we know, no, right? One hopes, right? Yeah, given the situation laid out there, one hopes they're not sensing anything anymore. So there's no particular reason to feel bad for them, right? Their problems are over. But the thought of what a corpse experiences, right, terrifies us. The thought of being underground with no light, the thought of, carrion creatures crawling around us and things like that, right? These things frighten us, even though the dead person doesn't sense them at all. And in particular, what frightens us? What's the thing that he says bothers us the most in imagining this situation?
To be obliterated from memory?
Yeah, to be forgotten, right? To know that the world continues to go on without you. So ultimately, all of this comes down to how we feel about ourselves, right? So our whole notion of morality comes only from our personal experience and our ability to kind of project our personal experience into other situations. and from our personal sensory apparatus and what it allows us to imagine. Now there's one more passage that I want to look at here, and then because y'all were the only two who were good enough to come today, I'll give you the reading questions for next time and let you go a little early, because I think you get it. I don't think the actual argument here is too difficult to understand, even if the language is a little funny. Can I get somebody to read for us on page 458, the paragraph at the bottom? It starts, "This, however, does not hold universally."
This, however, does not hold universally, or with regard to every passion. There are some passions of which the expressions excite no sort of sympathy, but, before we are acquainted with what gave occasion to them, serve rather to disgust and provoke us against them. The furious behavior of an angry man is more likely to exasperate us against himself than against his enemies. As we are unacquainted with his provocation, we cannot bring his case home to ourselves, nor conceive anything like the passions which it excites. But we plainly see what is the situation of those with whom he is angry, and to what violence they may he exposed from so enraged an adversary.
Mm-hmm.
We readily therefore sympathize with their fear or resentment, and we are immediately disposed to take part against the man from whom they appear to be in danger.
Okay, so say that, y'all showed up without doing the reading, and you're just kind of sitting here throwing paper airplanes at each other, chewing gum, chatting back and forth, not paying attention to anything that I'm saying, right? And I get mad, and I start shouting, and I start flipping desks. My department chair comes down the hall, walks in, sees what's happening. Is he likely, according to Smith here, to sympathize with me or to sympathize with you? Why?
Because he doesn't understand the situation.
Yeah, he didn't see what you did to piss me off, right? He sees the way I'm behaving, and that I am perhaps posing a threat to you, right? So, if we're in a situation where we can't read imaginatively in this way, right? We're gonna sympathize with the people who look like they're being victimized, rather than the person who looks like he's threatening them, right? Because we don't know his reasons for this particular outburst. So again, all of this ultimately comes to, if we're looking for a theme in this, right? It's that all of our moral feelings and all of our sympathy are centered in our notion of self. We can only imagine what others are feeling by projecting ourselves into their positions. And sometimes this creates sympathy with people who don't actually need it, because we can only imagine really how we would feel in our present state. All right, so y'all have any questions about this? Okay, so Jeremy Bentham, who we're going to be looking at for next time, actually has an even simpler view of human nature, which is based on a very simple alliterative binary pleasure and pain. So let me give you the guide questions for that. And then we'll let you go. And Ron, if you wanted to come to my office and talk, I know your appointment's at 2, but we may as well just talk now.